He stood at the center of Madison Square Garden, wearing yellow sunglasses, dancing for 20,000 screaming fans. 18 years later, he was found hanging in a solitary confinement cell, with 0 cameras watching and defensive bruises on his hands. Brian Christopher Lawler spent his life trying to escape the shadow of his father, the king, only to die in the very cage his family thought would save him. How does the man who brought the most joy to the Attitude Era end up as the victim of its darkest, most violent mystery? Brian Christopher's life began not in a nursery, but effectively in the locker room of the Mid-South Coliseum. From the moment he possessed cognitive awareness, Brian understood that his father was different. While other fathers returned home from factories or offices with briefcases, Jerry Lawler returned home with bruises, bandages, and the roaring energy of 10,000 screaming fans clinging to his clothes. For a child, this proximity to a living superhero is intoxicating, but it is also deeply confusing. Brian's earliest memories were sensory overloads: the smell of wintergreen rubbing alcohol, the pungent aroma of unwashed canvas and sweat, the terrifyingly loud ring of the bell, and the sight of his father, his protector, bleeding profusely from the forehead while a crowd cheered. This normalized violence and performance for Brian before he could even read. He learned that pain was a currency, and that attention was the ultimate prize. However, the domestic reality was far less glamorous than the Monday night lights. Jerry and Brian's mother, Kay, divorced around 1978 when Brian was just 6 years old. The dissolution of the marriage shattered the family unit and placed Brian in a precarious psychological position. He lived primarily with his mother, meaning the king was often a distant figure, a man he saw more often on the television screen on Saturday mornings than at the dinner table. This separation created a fundamental wound in Brian's psyche, a desperate, gnawing hunger for his father's presence that would later mutate into a hunger for the crowd's approval. He watched championship wrestling not just as a fan, but as a son trying to decode his father. He studied Jerry's cadence, his facial expressions, and his timing, internalizing the rhythms of the business as a way to feel connected to the man who was absent. As Brian grew into adolescence, he began to exhibit a distinct personality trait that baffled those around him, a fierce, almost aggressive desire for independence. He loathed the idea of being a daddy's boy. He wanted to carve out a piece of the world that belonged solely to him, untouched by the Lawler legacy. This manifested most bizarrely in his choice of sports allegiance. In the heart of the American South, surrounded by Tennessee Volunteers and later Tennessee Titans fans, Brian Lawler became a die-hard, obsessive fan of the Pittsburgh Steelers. He covered his bedroom walls in black and gold. He wore Steelers jerseys constantly. Psychologically, this was a profound statement. Pittsburgh was a gritty, industrial northern city. Culturally, a world away from Memphis. By latching onto the Steelers, Brian was subconsciously rejecting the Memphis hegemony. It was his safe harbor. Throughout his tumultuous life, through the arrests and the relapses, his love for the Steelers remained one of the few pure, untainted aspects of his personality. It was a space where he was just a fan, not a prince. In high school, Brian was a paradox. He was popular, charismatic, and naturally athletic, playing baseball and football with a frantic energy. But he was also deeply insecure. He was hyper-aware of the whispers. Teachers, coaches, and classmates all viewed him through the prism of his father. Is he as tough as Jerry? Does he think he's better than us? He developed a defense mechanism that would later define his wrestling persona: arrogance. If people were going to judge him, he would give them a reason. He became the class clown, the loudmouth, the center of attention. If he couldn't control the narrative of his family, He would control the room with his volume and his antics. Yet despite his attempts to push away the wrestling world, the gravitational pull was inescapable. By his late teens, Bryan was secretly training. He didn't ask for a red carpet. He went to the rusted, sweat-stained gyms on the outskirts of town. He took the bumps. He learned to fall. He learned the bump card, the finite number of falls a wrestler's body can take. He wanted to do this, but he was terrified of the word nepotism. He knew that in the shark tank of the locker room, respect was earned in blood, not birthright. He was determined to bleed. In September 1989, Bryan Christopher Lawler made his professional debut. But Bryan Lawler was nowhere to be found. Instead, a masked wrestler named Nebula walked through the curtain at the Sportatorium. Bryan, alongside partner Tony Williams, formed the tag team The Twilight Zone. The mask was not just a piece of fabric, it was a psychological necessity. Under the hood of Nebula, Bryan was free. The audience didn't know who he was, which meant their cheers or boos were honest. When he executed a drop kick or took a clothesline, they were reacting to his skill, not his lineage. For months, Bryan wrestled in anonymity. He worked the loops, the grueling circuit of small towns in Tennessee, Arkansas, and Kentucky that made up the USWA territory. He drove hundreds of miles for $40 payoffs, slept in cars, and ate at gas stations. This was his apprenticeship. He was proving to the veterans in the back, men like Bill Dundee and Dutch Mantell, that he wasn't there to play king, he was there to work. During this period, Bryan's style began to emerge. Unlike his father, who was a brawler known for punches and pile drivers, Bryan was a flyer. He was smaller, faster, and more acrobatic. He incorporated moves from Japanese tapes he had watched, bringing a level of athleticism that was rare in the plodding, punch-heavy style of Memphis. Eventually, the mask had to come off. The reveal was a major storyline in Memphis, but it brought with it the moment Bryan had dreaded, the acknowledgement of his name. However, Bryan made a critical pivot immediately upon unmasking. He refused to use the name Lawler. He insisted on being introduced as Bryan Christopher. It was a defiance that bordered on insolence in a town built by his father. He leaned fully into the heel role. He created the persona of too sexy Bryan Christopher. He slicked his hair back, wore brightly colored tights, and adopted a strut that screamed vanity. But the centerpiece of the character was the laugh. Bryan developed a cackle, a high-pitched, rhythmic, hyena-like laugh that was designed to be the most annoying sound in the world. He would grab the microphone, insult the local crowd's intelligence, insult their sports teams, and then unleash that laugh. It worked brilliantly. The fans hated him. They wanted to see him destroyed. By inciting their hatred, Bryan protected himself from their judgment. If they booed him, he could tell himself it was because he was doing a great job as a villain, not because they resented his privilege. It was a brilliant protective layer of performance art. Throughout the early 90s, Bryan Christopher became the workhorse of the USWA. While Jerry Lawler was the special attraction, Bryan was the guy carrying the nightly shows. The statistics are staggering. He held the USWA Heavyweight Championship 26 times and held over 40 titles in total within the promotion. Critics argued this was nepotism. His father owned the company after all. But the tapes tell a different story. Bryan was genuinely one of the best workers in the territory. He had incredible cardio. He could bump maniacally to make his opponents look like monsters, and his timing on the microphone was sharp. He engaged in brutal feuds with local legends like Jeff Jarrett and Bill Dundee. These matches were often bloody, intense affairs that garnered high ratings on the Saturday morning broadcast. But the most psychologically complex feud was with his own father. On several occasions, the booking required Bryan to wrestle Jerry. These weren't friendly exhibition matches. The storylines often revolved around the spoiled son needing to be taught a lesson by the veteran father. In the ring, Jerry would punch Bryan with stiff, heavy hands. Bryan would sell the beatings, stumbling around the ring, begging for mercy. For the audience, it was great drama. But for Bryan, the lines must have blurred. Here he was in his 20s, still being physically disciplined by his father for the amusement of strangers. He was earning his father's respect professionally by letting his father beat him publicly. It was a twisted dynamic that reinforced the idea that love and violence were intertwined. By the mid-1990s, Memphis was a dying territory. The WWE and WCW were becoming national juggernauts, swallowing up the regional scenes. Bryan knew he had to leave the nest to survive. Before his departure, he was paired with a young third-generation wrestler who had been sent to Memphis to learn the ropes. His name was Dwayne Johnson, wrestling then as Flex Cavana. Bryan and Dwayne formed a tag team. It is a historical curiosity now to look back and see the future biggest movie star in the world tagging with Bryan Christopher in a dim, smoky arena in Tennessee. They traveled together, ate at Waffle Houses together, and split the meager pay. In later years, The Rock would speak fondly of Bryan. He credited Bryan with teaching him how to work the Memphis crowd, how to manage the heat. Bryan was the veteran in that dynamic. He was the one leading the matches. It showed Bryan's potential. He could keep up with and even lead a talent as immense as The Rock. In 1995, Bryan got his first major break with a national company, World Championship Wrestling. It was his chance to step out of Jerry's shadow completely. He was hired to be a part of their burgeoning cruiserweight division. However, this opportunity turned into a disaster that would haunt his career. He was booked into a feud with a wrestler named the Blacktop Bully. The WCW bookers came up with a bizarre concept for their match at the Uncensored pay-per-view, the King of the Road match. The two men were to wrestle in the back of a moving 18-wheeler truck as it drove around the back roads of Georgia. It was a pre-taped segment. The conditions were awful. The truck was shaking, there was hay everywhere, and it was impossible to have a good wrestling match. Desperate to make an impression and salvage the terrible concept, Bryan and Dustin made a secret agreement. They decided to juice to add drama to the fight. They didn't know that WCW had recently instituted a strict no-blood policy to appease their corporate censors. When the tape was reviewed by WCW management, they were furious. Despite Bryan putting his body on the line in a moving vehicle, he was fired immediately. The firing was devastating. Bryan had finally made it to the big leagues, only to be sent home for trying too hard to entertain. He returned to Memphis humiliated. The narrative in his head was reinforced. The world outside is unfair. Only Memphis is safe. Only my father can protect me. For the next 2 years, Bryan rebuilt himself in the USWA, but his eyes were fixed on the North, the World Wrestling Federation. In 1997, the call finally came. The WWF was struggling in the ratings war against WCW and needed fresh talent for their light heavyweight division. They signed Bryan. This was the summit. The WWF was the biggest stage on earth. But as Bryan packed his bags for Stamford, Connecticut, he wasn't just bringing his boots and his tights. He was bringing a decade of unresolved daddy issues, a growing dependency on painkillers and alcohol to manage the physical toll of the Memphis style, and a desperate, fragile ego that was about to be tested by the most ruthless corporate machine in entertainment history. He was leaving the kingdom of Memphis, but he was about to find that the demons he thought he was leaving behind had packed their bags too. In the summer of 1997, Brian Christopher Lawler arrived in Stamford, Connecticut, the headquarters of the World Wrestling Federation. He was 25 years old, a seasoned veteran of the Memphis circuit with nearly a decade of experience and 40 championships to his name. In Tennessee, he walked into arenas like a gladiator. He commanded the locker room. He dictated the pace of his matches. But in the cavernous, concrete hallways of the WWF, Brian Christopher was nobody. The transition from the territorial system to the global corporate machine of the WWF was a culture shock that broke many wrestlers, and it hit Brian with particular force. In Memphis, the business was a family affair, literally and figuratively. It was loose, improvised, and rugged. The WWF, by contrast, was a Shark Tank. It was a multi-million-dollar television production where every second of airtime was fought over by some of the most ruthless, ambitious men on the planet. Shawn Michaels, Stone Cold Steve Austin, The Undertaker, Bret Hart. Brian was brought in not to be a main event star, but to be a soldier in a specific war. The WWF was getting hammered in the ratings by their rival, WCW, specifically because WCW showcased high-flying cruiserweights like Rey Mysterio and Eddie Guerrero. The WWF needed an answer. They decided to reboot their light heavyweight division. Brian was signed to be a pillar of this new initiative. On paper, it was a perfect fit. Brian was athletic, charismatic, and hungry. But the moment he walked through the curtain for his debut, the ghost of his father was waiting for him. The WWF made a creative decision regarding Brian's debut that, in hindsight, was psychologically devastating. They decided to acknowledge his talent but deny his lineage. He would be introduced simply as Brian Christopher. However, the man calling his matches on commentary was none other than Jerry the King Lawler, sitting alongside Jim Ross. The dynamic they established was a running shoot. Every time Brian came out, Jim Ross, playing the straight man, would drop heavy hints. "King, this young man looks awfully familiar," Ross would say. "He has a certain royal demeanor. He laughs just like you." And Jerry Lawler, in his heel persona, would vehemently deny it. "I've never seen this kid before in my life, but he's handsome. He's talented. He's clearly a future star." To the audience at home, it was a funny bit. It added a layer of meta-humor to the show. But consider the psychological toll this took on Brian. He was finally on the biggest stage in the world, trying to establish his own identity, trying to prove he wasn't just a nepotism hire, and yet the soundtrack to his matches was his own father publicly disowning him for a laugh. Every week, millions of people heard his father say, "He's not my son." Even though it was a work, it reinforced the core insecurity of Brian's life, that he was a secret to be kept, a prop in his father's show. It robbed him of the ability to stand on his own merit because the audience wasn't watching Brian Christopher wrestle. They were watching Jerry Lawler's son try to pretend he wasn't Jerry Lawler's son. Backstage, this dynamic created heat. The WWF locker room in 1997 was notoriously political. The top stars were paranoid about their spots. The mid-carders were desperate. When Brian walked in, many saw him as the beneficiary of extreme favoritism. They saw Jerry Lawler campaigning for the kid. They saw Brian getting TV time over other guys who had been there longer. It didn't matter that Brian was a better worker than half the roster. Perception is reality in wrestling. He was isolated. He wasn't one of the boys in the traditional sense. He was the prince, protected by the king. This isolation pushed Brian further into the lifestyle that would eventually consume him. On the road, alone in rental cars and hotel rooms, the camaraderie he had known in Memphis was gone. To cope with the physical pain of the schedule and the emotional pain of the isolation, the culture offered a ready solution: painkillers, muscle relaxers, and alcohol. The party was the only place where everyone was equal. The culmination of the WWF's new light heavyweight division was a tournament to crown a new champion in late 1997. The finals were set for the In Your House D-Generation X pay-per-view in December. The bracket came down to two men, Taka Michinoku, a Japanese sensation who was arguably the best flyer in the world at the time, and Brian Christopher. In Brian's mind, and in the minds of many Memphis loyalists, this was supposed to be his coronation. He had carried the division on the microphone. He was the best heel in the tournament. Wrestling Logic 101 dictates that you put the belt on the bad guy so the good guy can chase him. Brian expected to win. He expected to validate his entire career by holding a WWF Championship belt over his head. On December 7th, 1997, in Springfield, Massachusetts, Brian walked to the ring to face Taka Michinoku. The match remains one of the hidden gems of that era. It was fast, stiff, and technically brilliant. Brian worked as the bully, grounding Taka's aerial offense with vicious strikes and arrogant posturing. He unleashed his signature laugh, taunting the crowd, desperate for them to hate him for him, not his dad. But the finish of the match did not go Brian's way. Taka Michinoku hit his finisher, the Michinoku driver, and pinned Brian clean in the middle of the ring. The referee counted 3. The bell rang. Taka was the champion. Brian lay on the mat, staring up at the lights. It wasn't just a loss in a scripted sport. It was a message from the office. You are good, but you are not the guy. They had chosen the outsider, the Japanese import, over the son of the king. The defeat relegated Brian to the mid-card wilderness. The light heavyweight division quickly floundered. Vince McMahon, the owner of the WWF, never really cared for smaller wrestlers. He liked giants. The division became an afterthought, and Brian Christopher became an afterthought along with it. He spent the first half of 1998 in purgatory. He was wrestling on the B shows, Shotgun, Saturday Night, and Sunday Night Heat. He was losing to bigger stars to make them look good. The dream of being a solo superstar was dying. He was dangerously close to being released, just another territorial star who couldn't cut it in the big leagues. He needed a lifeline. He found it in the unlikeliest of places. In the locker room, there was another guy sitting by himself, staring at the writing on the wall. His name was Scott Taylor. Scott was a talented journeyman wrestler from Maine. He was technically sound, a great bumper, and a nice guy. But he had absolutely no character. He was generic wrestler number 4. He was being used as enhancement talent, a polite term for a guy who gets paid to lose. Brian and Scott started traveling together. They bonded over their mutual frustration. They were 2 light heavyweights in a land of giants, 2 guys who knew they could entertain if given a microphone and 5 minutes of airtime. They approached the creative team with an idea. Put us together. We have nothing to lose. The WWF agreed, but the gimmick they were given was questionable. They were named Too Much. The Too Much gimmick was a product of the immature shock jock humor of the late 90s. The premise was that Brian and Scott were overly affectionate. They weren't explicitly gay. That would have been too straightforward for the time. But they were ambiguously gay. They hugged too long. They critiqued each other's outfits. They shared hotel rooms in the storylines. It was designed to get cheap heat from a homophobic audience. It was low-hanging fruit. But Brian and Scott made a pact. If this is what they give us, we are going to be the best at it in the world. They committed to the bit with a fearlessness that was startling. Brian, in particular, threw away any shred of vanity he had left. He started wearing louder shirts, bucket hats, and oversized sunglasses. He amplified his laugh until it sounded like a weapon. They started cheating in matches, not like tough guys, but like bratty children. They would hide behind referees. They would scream in high-pitched voices when they got hit. And a strange thing happened. They started getting TV time. They weren't winning titles, but they were on Raw. They were getting reactions. The crowd despised them. Brian Christopher had found a way to survive. He became the court jester. If he couldn't be the king, he would be the fool. And in Shakespearean terms, the fool is often the only one allowed to speak the truth. Their most prominent feud during this period was against Al Snow, a wrestler who carried a mannequin head around and talked to it. It was peak Attitude Era absurdity. Brian and Scott stole the mannequin head. For weeks, the storyline of Monday Night Raw involved Brian Christopher and Scott Taylor taking this plastic head on dates, putting makeup on it, and essentially holding it hostage. It was ridiculous. It was stupid. It was arguably offensive, but it was over. Fans brought signs referencing it. The ratings for their segments held steady. Brian proved that he could take absolute garbage writing and turn it into watchable television through sheer force of charisma. He was funny. He had a comedic timing that rivaled the professional actors on the show. This period, from mid-1998 to early 1999, was the bridge. It was the moment Brian realized that his path to stardom wasn't through wrestling five-star technical classics like he did in Memphis. It was through sports entertainment. It was through character. But he was still a heel. He was still the guy you wanted to see punched. He hadn't yet found the magic ingredient that would turn him into a beloved icon. By 1999, hip-hop culture had fully permeated the mainstream. MTV, fashion, and language were all dominated by rap and R&B. The WWF, always desperate to appear hip and relevant, wanted to tap into this energy. Brian and Scott looked at their too much gimmick and realized it had a ceiling. You can only be the annoying, ambiguous bad guys for so long before people get bored. They needed an evolution. They started tweaking their wardrobe. The bright colors stayed, but the cuts changed. They started wearing baggy cargo pants, bandanas, and jerseys. They started incorporating hip-hop slang into their promos, often using it incorrectly on purpose to look like posers. They were trying to be cool, but the joke was that they were two white guys, one from Maine, one from Tennessee, who were trying way too hard. They changed their name to Too Cool. Scott Taylor became Scotty Too Hotty. Brian Christopher became Master Sexay. The name Master Sexay was a nod to Grandmaster Flash, one of the pioneers of hip-hop, but twisted through Brian's delusional self-image. It was perfect. It was a name that made you laugh the first time you heard it, but it stuck. The critical evolution happened almost by accident. Before matches, or sometimes after a cheap win, Brian and Scott started dancing. It wasn't a choreographed routine at first. It was just Brian feeling the rhythm of their entrance music and doing a goofy, rhythmic bounce. Scotty joined in with the worm, a breakdancing move where he would chop the ground and wiggle across the ring. Initially, they did it to mock the fans. Look at us. We're having a great time while you losers watch. But the reaction began to shift. The fans stopped booing. They started clapping. There is an infectious quality to genuine joy, even if it's coming from a bad guy. Brian Christopher was having fun in that ring. You could see it. For the first time in his life, he wasn't worrying about his dad watching from the announce table. He wasn't worrying about the nepotism whispers. He was just a guy in yellow sunglasses dancing to a beat. The WWF producers, confused but observant, noticed the shift. They decided to test the waters. What if we turned them babyface? To fully turn them into good guys, they needed a catalyst. They needed someone to legitimize them. Two skinny guys dancing is funny. 2 skinny guys and a 400-pound Samoan monster, dancing is a spectacle. Rikishi Fatu was a veteran from the legendary Anoa'i wrestling family. He had been saddled with bad gimmicks for years. In late 1999, he was repackaged as Rikishi, a bleach blonde heavyweight with a giant rear end and a bad attitude. The writers paired him with Too Cool. The logic was contrast. The little guys would get into trouble and the big guy would bail them out. But the chemistry was instantaneous and alchemical. Brian, Scotty, and Rikishi clicked. They started traveling together. They shared a sense of humor. And then came the moment that changed everything. One night on Raw, after a match, Brian grabbed the microphone. The lights dimmed. He put on the sunglasses. "Hit it!" he screamed. The music changed to a heavy, funky hip-hop loop. Brian and Scotty started their dance. But then they stopped and looked at Rikishi. The giant stood there, stoic, menacing. The crowd held its breath. Was he going to kill them? Then slowly Rikishi put on his own pair of yellow sunglasses. He looked at Brian. He looked at Scotty. And he began to dance. The arena exploded. It wasn't just a cheer. It was a roar of pure delight. Seeing this massive, dangerous man pop-locking alongside Grandmaster Sexay was the most entertaining thing on the show. In that moment, Brian Christopher ceased to be Jerry Lawler's son. He became the conductor of the Too Cool train, while the on-screen narrative of 1998 and 1999 is one of ascent and finding his groove. The off-screen narrative is the beginning of the slide. The life of a WWF superstar in the Attitude Era was grueling. They were on the road 300 days a year. They drove hundreds of miles between towns every night, fueled by adrenaline and caffeine. They wrestled hurt. There was no time off. If you got hurt, you lost your spot. If you lost your spot, you stopped getting paid. Brian was dealing with chronic pain from a decade of taking bumps. In Memphis, he could go home to his own bed. Now, he was living out of a suitcase. To manage the pain and the boredom of the road, Brian began to dabble more heavily in prescription pills. Somalize, Vicodin, Lortab, these were as common as candy. In the locker room of that era, they helped you sleep after the show. They helped you loosen up before the match. They numbed the loneliness of the hotel room. Brian was also drinking heavily. The party persona of Grandmaster Sexay wasn't entirely an act. He was the life of the bar after the show. He was the guy buying shots, the guy making everyone laugh with his hyena cackle, but there is a difference between partying for fun and partying for survival. For Brian, the line was blurring. He was using the substances to mask the lingering insecurity. Even with the crowd cheering for Too Cool, the voice in his head was still whispering. Jerry Lawler was still on commentary. The joke about Brian not being his son was still a weekly staple of the broadcast. Even as Brian succeeded, the goalposts moved. Now the narrative was, well, he's only over because he's dancing with Rikishi. He couldn't win. So he numbed himself. There were minor incidents during this time, missed wake-up calls, arriving at the arena late, looking a little too glossy during pre-match meetings. But in the wrestling business of the late 90s, as long as you could perform when the red light went on, nobody asked questions. It was a culture of enabling. Brian was performing. He was more popular than ever. The merchandise was selling. The Too Cool t-shirts were flying off the shelves. The sunglasses were everywhere. As 1999 drew to a close, Brian Christopher Lawler stood on the precipice of the new millennium. He was about to enter the most successful year of his professional life. He was about to touch gold. He was about to become a household name. But he was walking onto that peak with a fractured foundation. The higher he climbed, the more dangerous the fall would be. The year 2000 would bring him everything he ever wanted, and it would set the stage for losing it all. The dance was just beginning, but the music was already starting to distort. As the calendar turned to the year 2000, the World Wrestling Federation was entering its commercial stratosphere, and Brian Christopher Lawler found himself strapped to the rocket. If the previous years had been a struggle for identity, the year 2000 was a coronation of charisma. The transformation was complete. Brian was no longer the hated heel or the nepotism kid from Memphis. He was Master Sexay, 1/3 of the most popular faction in the entire industry. The chemistry between Brian, Scotty Hotty, and the massive Rikishi had evolved from a mid-card comedy act into a legitimate cultural phenomenon that defied all traditional wrestling logic. In an era defined by stone-faced anti-heroes and violent aggression, Too Cool offered something radically different, unadulterated, infectious joy. The undeniable proof of their ascendancy arrived on January 23, 2000, inside the hallowed halls of Madison Square Garden at the Royal Rumble. This event is one of the pillars of the wrestling calendar, a night where careers are often made or broken by the reaction of the notoriously difficult New York City crowd. When Brian Christopher's music hit, the reaction wasn't polite, it was deafening. But the defining moment came during the Rumble match itself. In a surreal break from the violence, Brian, Scotty, and Rikishi cleared the ring, the house lights dimmed, and the heavy hip-hop beat dropped. As 20,000 New Yorkers rose to their feet, the three men performed their dance routine in the center of the ring. For those 30 seconds, nobody was fighting. The suspension of disbelief was total. Brian Christopher, dancing in his yellow bucket hat and goggles, had the entire world in the palm of his hand. It was the highest rating segment of the show. It was the moment he had chased since he was a child, watching his father from the wings of the Mid-South Coliseum. He was finally the star. Throughout the spring of 2000, Too Cool was ubiquitous. They were on every piece of merchandise. Their dance was mimicked in schoolyards across America. Brian was making more money than he had ever seen in his life. The payoffs for pay-per-view events and the royalty checks for t-shirt sales were astronomical. For a boy who grew up in the gritty nickel-and-dime economy of the Memphis territory, this was unimaginable wealth. But with the wealth and the adulation came a dangerous sense of invincibility. Brian was living the gimmick. The lines between Grandmaster Sexay, the party animal who loved everybody, and Brian Lawler, the insecure son with an addictive personality, were completely dissolved. He was the life of the party in every city, every night, and the party never stopped. The apex of Brian's professional life occurred on May 29, 2000, in Vancouver, British Columbia. It was an episode of Monday Night Raw, the flagship show. Too Cool was booked to face the dominant champions, Edge and Christian, for the WWF Tag Team Championship. By this point, Brian and Scotty were so popular that the company essentially had no choice but to put the titles on them. The crowd demanded it. The match was a masterclass in sports entertainment psychology. Brian played the peril, Scotty played the fire, and the integration of the rapper Joe C. at ringside added to the chaotic celebrity spectacle of the night. When the final bell rang and the referee handed Brian the championship belt, the emotion on his face was real. You can see it in the footage. He clutches the gold not like a prop, but like a lifeline. In the wrestling business, a title belt is a prop, yes, but it is also a thank you. It is the company saying, we trust you to carry our brand. For the son of Jerry Lawler, who had spent his entire life being told he was only there because of his last name, this was validation. He had won the World Tag Team titles on the biggest show on earth, and the crowd was screaming his name, not his father's. However, even in this moment of triumph, the specter of his father loomed. Jerry Lawler was calling the match from the commentary table. As Bryan celebrated, the dynamic remained unchanged. Jerry was proud, certainly, but on air, the distance was kept. The narrative was still convoluted. Bryan couldn't just run to his dad and hug him. He had to celebrate with Rikishi and Scotty. He had to maintain the illusion. The victory was sweet, but it was lonely. The reign lasted only 27 days, a short run by historical standards, but the length didn't matter to Bryan as much as the fact that it happened. He was a champion. He had reached the mountaintop. But mountaintops are dangerous places. The air is thin, and there is nowhere to go but down. As the summer of 2000 turned into autumn, the creative team's focus began to shift. The Too Cool act, while still popular, was becoming repetitive. The writers decided to split the group up to push Rikishi as a main event villain. In a shocking plot twist, Rikishi turned on his friends, claiming he had run over Stone Cold Steve Austin for The Rock. This storyline shattered the trio. Rikishi moved up to fight the main eventers, leaving Bryan and Scotty behind in the mid-card. Without the giant to anchor them, and without the novelty of the dance, Bryan and Scotty began to drift. They were still beloved, but they were no longer a priority. As his position on the card began to slip, Bryan's demons began to rise. The adrenaline of the main event was replaced by the anxiety of job security. In the WWF, if you aren't moving up, you are moving out. Bryan sensed the cooling of the company's interest. He began to self-medicate more aggressively. The culture of the locker room in late 2000 and early 2001 was a hazardous environment for someone with Bryan's genetic predisposition to addiction. Painkillers were standard operating procedure for the physical toll of the ring, but for Bryan, they became a way to numb the silence of the hotel room. Alcohol became the fuel for the Grand Master Sexay persona that he felt he had to maintain 24/7. But a darker shadow had entered the picture: cocaine. In the high-speed, high-stress world he was living in, cocaine was the energy boost that kept the party going. It was the false confidence that replaced the natural charisma he felt was fading. Friends and colleagues from that time noticed a change. The fun-loving, goofy Bryan was becoming erratic. He was edgier. The laugh was a little too loud, the eyes a little too wide. He was missing cues. He was showing up to arenas looking disheveled, sweating out toxins from the night before. The WWF management, historically tolerant of boys being boys as long as business was good, was starting to clean up its image as it prepared to go public and eventually transition into a PG era years later. They were less willing to look the other way. Bryan was warned. He was told to tighten up. But the grip of addiction is illogical. It whispers that you are fine, that you can handle it, that you are the Grand Master and the rules don't apply to you. Bryan believed he was indispensable because the fans still cheered. He didn't realize that in the corporate machine, everyone is replaceable. The year 2001 brought a seismic shift to the industry. The WWF purchased WCW, ending the Monday Night Wars. Suddenly, the roster doubled in size. Dozens of top-tier talents from WCW were flooding into the WWF, hungry for spots. The pressure on mid-card talent like Bryan Lawler increased exponentially. There was no room for error anymore. Every match was an audition to keep your job. In this high-pressure cooker, Bryan's coping mechanisms completely failed him. He wasn't sleeping. He was running on fumes and chemicals. The end of Bryan Christopher's WWE career did not happen in the ring. It happened at a border crossing. In May 2001, the WWF was touring Western Canada. It was a standard loop, crossing from the United States into Canada. For wrestlers, border crossings are routine but tense. They know they are targets for scrutiny. Bryan was traveling alone or with a small group. Accounts vary, but when he pulled up to the Canadian Customs checkpoint, he was flagged for a random search. Perhaps he looked nervous. Perhaps he looked like a wrestler. The officers ordered him out of the vehicle and began to search his luggage. What they found was not a small amount for personal use. It was a catalog of destruction. According to the police reports filed in Calgary, authorities discovered cocaine, marijuana, and other controlled substances hidden in his bag. It was a significant bust. He was arrested on the spot. The news traveled back to Stamford, Connecticut, faster than Brian could make a phone call. In the world of 2001 WWF, a drug arrest at an international border was a cardinal sin. It was messy. It was public. It caused visa issues that would make him unable to work in Canada, a major market. But more than the logistical headache, it gave the company the excuse they needed to cut ties with a talent who had become a liability. Brian was released from custody, but the phone call he received from the WWF Relations Department was brief and brutal. He was fired. Breach of contract. The termination was effective immediately. In the blink of an eye, the music stopped. The dancing stopped. The checks stopped. Brian Lawler was 30 years old, and the only career he had ever known, the only identity he had ever valued, was stripped away. The aftermath of the firing was a chaotic swirl of humiliation and denial. Publicly, the story was that Brian had personal issues to sort out. Privately, he was devastated. But the most painful aspect of the firing was the reaction of his father. Jerry Lawler was still an employee of the company. The dynamic between Jerry and Brian regarding the firing is a subject of much speculation and sadness. Jerry Lawler, from his perspective, had spent a lifetime trying to get Brian to take the business seriously, to stay clean, to protect his spot. He saw the firing as a consequence of Brian's own choices. There was a tough love approach. Jerry didn't storm into Vince McMahon's office and demand his son be reinstated. He knew the business too well. He knew Brian had crossed a line. For Brian, this perceived lack of support from the king was a dagger to the heart. He felt abandoned by the company he loved and the father he idolized. He returned to Memphis, but it wasn't a hero's welcome. He was the prodigal son who had burned out. He was the guy who had it all and threw it away for a bag of white powder. The months following his release in June 2001 were a dark blur. Brian tried to maintain the Master Sexay persona on the independent circuit. He would show up at high school gyms and county fairs, putting on the glasses, doing the dance, and the fans still loved it. They still cheered. But it was a hollow echo of the roar at Madison Square Garden. He was playing a cover version of himself. The money from the independent shows was good, but it wasn't WWF money, and the expenses of his addiction were not decreasing. He began to spiral. The discipline required to maintain a physique and a performance level evaporated. He lost weight. He looked gaunt. The spark in his eyes was replaced by a dull, glazed look. He tried to pivot. In 2002, a new promotion called TNA started up in Nashville, just down the road. It was an opportunity for a fresh start. Brian was signed. He made a conscious decision to shed the Master Sexay persona. He wanted to be serious again. He joined a faction called the Next Generation, acknowledging his lineage openly for the first time in years. He stood alongside David Flair, the son of Ric Flair. It should have worked. The story wrote itself, the sons of legends trying to escape the shadows. But Brian wasn't ready. His heart wasn't in the wrestling. His mind was enslaved by the substances. The TNA run was lackluster. He lacked the fire he had in 1997. He was going through the motions, collecting a paycheck to feed the habit. By 2003, he was largely out of the major spotlight. He had become a name on the indies, a guy you booked to sell tickets because he used to be on TV. This is a dangerous phase for any wrestler. It is the purgatory between stardom and retirement, a place where bad habits are enabled by promoters who just want to happy talk you into the ring. Bryan was surrounded by enablers, people who wanted to party with Grandmaster Sexay, not help Brian Lawler. And deep down, the depression was taking root. It wasn't just the drugs, it was the profound sense of failure. He had proven his father right. He had proven the locker room critics right. He had failed. This narrative of self-loathing began to loop in his mind, louder and louder, drowning out the music. He was a king without a kingdom, a dancer without a stage, and he was falling faster than anyone realized. By 2004, the landscape of professional wrestling had shifted tectonically once again. The Attitude Era, that wild crash TV frontier that had birthed Grandmaster Sexay, was dead. It had been replaced by the Ruthless Aggression Era, a period defined by technical precision, grim determination, and a new breed of athletes like Brock Lesnar, John Cena, and Randy Orton. In this new ecosystem, Brian Christopher Lawler was a man out of time. He was a relic of a party that had already ended, trying to find a seat at a table that no longer had a place for him. However, the wrestling business is nothing if not nostalgic. It loves a redemption story, almost as much as it loves a tragedy. In early 2004, Jim Ross, the head of talent relations for WWE, extended a lifeline. Brian was re-signed. The narrative logic was sound. Brian had cleaned up, he was still young enough to go, and the audience still had a fond memory of the Too Cool days. He was sent to the developmental territories to knock off the ring rust and then brought up to the main roster. But the second tenure of Grandmaster Sexay was a melancholy echo of the first. When he walked through the curtain in 2004, the pop was there. The fans remembered the dance, the glasses, the energy, but the magic was gone. The writers didn't know what to do with him. He wasn't a fresh young prospect anymore. He was a 32-year-old veteran with baggage. He was used sparingly, mostly to put over younger talent. The most crushing realization for Brian during this period must have been his disposability. In 1999, he was a merchandise machine. In 2004, he was content. He lasted only a few months. By July 2004, he was released again. The reasons were familiar: inconsistency, unreliability, and the sense that his personal demons were still lurking in the shadows. But this second firing hit harder than the first. The first time, you can blame youth or the wild culture of the road. The second time, it feels like a verdict on your soul. It confirmed his deepest fear, that his success was a fluke, a product of the right gimmick at the right time, and that without the Too Cool machine behind him, he was just another guy named Lawler who couldn't fill his father's boots. Between 2005 and 2009, Brian entered a strange purgatorial state of existence known in the industry as the nostalgia run. He wasn't a full-time WWE superstar, but he wasn't fully gone either. He became a special attraction, a ghost called upon whenever the WWE needed a cheap pop or familiar face to humiliate. He would appear sporadically. In 2006, he showed up on Raw to defend the honor of the wrestling legends against the Spirit Squad. In 2009, he appeared on SmackDown in a match against The Miz. Let's analyze that 2009 appearance against The Miz deeply, because it is a microcosm of Brian's tragedy. The Miz was the new loudmouth, the new arrogant heel, essentially the modern version of what Brian Christopher was in 1993. The segment was designed for Brian to come out, do the dance, make the crowd smile, and then get beaten decisively to make The Miz look dangerous. Brian performed his role perfectly. He hit the ropes, he played to the crowd, he took the pinfall, but look at his eyes in that footage. There is a heaviness there. He was physically slower, his face was puffy, a telltale sign of the alcohol and medication abuse that was ravaging his internal organs. He was Grandmaster Sexay on the outside, but inside, he was a man screaming for help. These appearances were double-edged swords. They provided a payday, yes. They gave him a momentary hit of the dopamine that comes from hearing 15,000 people cheer your name. But they also reinforced his stagnation. They trapped him in the past. He couldn't evolve. He couldn't try a new character or a new style because the WWE only wanted the dancing guy. He was a prisoner of his own creation, forced to wear the yellow sunglasses and do the hip-hop dance even as his life was falling apart. When the WWE phone stopped ringing, Bryan was left with the indies. The independent wrestling circuit can be a noble place for young lions learning their craft, but for a fallen star in his mid-30s, it is often a grim wasteland. Bryan Christopher Lawler was a name. Promoters in high school gymnasiums across America would book him to draw a house. They would put his face on the poster, "See former WWE superstar, Master Sexay." The reality of these shows was a stark contrast to Madison Square Garden. Bryan was changing in locker rooms that were often just high school classrooms or storage closets. He was wrestling in front of 200 people on a Friday night in rural Arkansas or Indiana. And in this environment, the King's Son tax was higher than ever. Local wrestlers, eager to make a name for themselves, would often work stiff with him, trying to prove they were tougher than Jerry Lawler's kid. Fans would heckle him with a cruelty that is unique to intimate venues where the wrestler can hear every individual insult. "Where's your daddy? Washed up. You're nothing without Rikishi." To cope with this degradation, Bryan's partying ceased to be a celebration and became an anesthesia. The post-show routine was rigid. Find a bar, find a dealer, find oblivion. He was surrounded by rats and marks who wanted to buy him drinks just to say they got drunk with Grandmaster Sexay. They were enablers, feeding the very addiction that was killing him, all for the sake of a story they could tell their friends. It was during these years, roughly 2008 to 2011, that the transition from functional addict to crisis occurred. The stories from promoters began to change. It wasn't just that Bryan was fun at the bar. It was that he was passing out in the locker room. It was that he was missing flights. It was that he was showing up to shows without his gear or in no condition to perform. The year 2009 marked a pivotal turning point in the public narrative of Bryan Christopher. Until this point, his issues were rumors, dirt sheet gossip, or inside baseball known only to the boys in the back. But in 2009, the problems moved from the locker room to the police blotter. On June 26, 2009, Bryan was arrested in Jackson, Tennessee. The charge was public intoxication, but the details of the arrest report painted a disturbing picture of a man who had lost control of his faculties. According to police records, officers responded to a disorderly person call. They found Bryan in a state of extreme agitation. He wasn't just drunk, he was belligerent. When they attempted to detain him, he allegedly became aggressive, threatening the officers. This wasn't the fun Bryan. This was the dark Bryan. The alcohol, likely mixed with prescription pills, had stripped away the veneer of the entertainer. He was arrested and booked. The mugshot from this arrest circulated on the internet. It was shocking to fans who still remembered the smiling face of Too Cool. Bryan looked bloated, angry, and confused. It was the first undeniable piece of evidence that something was terribly, terribly wrong. He pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 30 days in jail because he had failed to complete a previously ordered rehabilitation program. This is a crucial detail. The legal system had already tried to intervene. They had ordered rehab. Bryan had walked away. It underscored the central tragedy of his addiction, his absolute refusal to admit he had a problem. Jerry Lawler, watching this unfold, was helpless. In later interviews and in his autobiography, Jerry spoke of the agony of this period. He noted that he offered to pay for the best rehab facilities in the country. He offered to fly Bryan anywhere. But Bryan's pride, that same fierce independent streak that made him a Steelers fan in Memphis, prevented him from accepting his father's help. To accept Jerry's help was to admit that Jerry was right, and Bryan couldn't bear that. Behind the substance abuse lay a medical reality that was largely ignored until it was too late. During one of his brief stints in treatment or legal custody around this time, medical evaluations suggested that Bryan was suffering from major depressive disorder. This diagnosis reframes the entire narrative of his addiction. Bryan wasn't just a hedonist who liked to party. He was likely self-medicating a profound chemical imbalance in his brain. The highs of the wrestling ring were the only times he felt legitimate dopamine release. When the cheering stopped, the serotonin crashed. The depression was compounded by the unique trauma of his profession. Professional wrestlers from his era often suffer from CTE due to repeated concussions. While Bryan was never officially diagnosed with CTE post-mortem, the symptoms he displayed in his later years, impulse control issues, aggression, memory lapses, erratic mood swings, are consistent with brain trauma. He was a man fighting a war on three fronts: a genetic predisposition to addiction, a severe mood disorder, and potential neurological damage from decades of taking bumps. And he was trying to fight this war with vodka and Xanax. If 2009 was the warning shot, 2013 was the bombardment. On May 2nd, 2013, Bryan was arrested again, this time in Pennsylvania. He was pulled over for driving erratically. The police report is a catalog of chemical destruction. The officers noted he was slurring his speech and unable to stand steady. A blood test was administered. The results were terrifying. Bryan's system contained a lethal cocktail of alcohol, methadone, and Xanax. The combination of alcohol and benzos is notoriously dangerous. It can stop the heart or lead to complete blackouts where the user remains conscious but has zero memory or impulse control. That he was operating a motor vehicle in this state suggests a complete disregard for his own life. He was charged with DUI, but by now the cycle was entrenched. Arrest, bail, promise to change, relapse, repeat. The tragedy of the 2013 arrest is that it happened during another attempted comeback. Bryan had been working more dates, trying to get back into shape, but the pressure of performance, the anxiety of the road, and the physical pain always led him back to the bottle. This arrest effectively killed his marketability, even on the independent circuit. Promoters could no longer trust him. He became a liability. The bookings dried up. The money dried up. Bryan retreated further into isolation. He spent more time at his home in Tennessee, alone with his thoughts and his stash. His relationship with his family became strained to the breaking point. Jerry Lawler, who had always been his safety net, began to pull back, practicing a form of detachment with love, hoping that if Bryan hit rock bottom, he would finally wake up. But for Bryan Christopher, the bottom had a trapdoor. As 2013 bled into 2014, the world saw a man who had completely lost his way. The Grand Master Sexay persona was now a cruel irony, a mask worn by a dying man. The dancing had stopped a long time ago. Now he was just stumbling. And the law enforcement of Hardeman County, Tennessee, was watching, waiting for the final mistake. In the erratic timeline of Bryan Christopher's life, filled with steep valleys and brief peaks, February 27, 2014, stands as the final heartbreaking summit. The WWE was launching its new network and rebranding its developmental territory into NXT, a brand that catered to the hardcore wrestling fan base. To generate buzz for their first live special NXT arrival, they decided to tap into the nostalgia vein one last time. They booked a full reunion of Too Cool. Bryan, Scotty, Hotty and Rikishi were brought to Full Sail University in Florida to face a young, dominant tag team called the Ascension. For Bryan, now 42 years old, this phone call was more than a booking. It was a vindication. Despite the mugshots, despite the dirt sheet rumors, despite the years of silence, the biggest company in the world was calling him. It was proof, his addicted mind likely reasoned, that he was still a star, that he could still go. When the music hit that night, the reaction was visceral. The crowd at Full Sail, a younger, smarter audience that knew all about Bryan's troubles, suspended their cynicism. For 10 minutes, it was 2000 all over again. Bryan came out in the gear, the glasses, the swagger. He looked older, yes. The lines on his face were deeper, and he moved with a stiffness that betrayed the miles on his body. But when the beat dropped and they did the dance, the joy was pure. They lost the match, which was the correct business decision, the veterans putting over the new monsters. But the post-match scene is what lingers. Bryan stood in the ring, soaking in the applause, smiling that wide, infectious smile. Nobody knew it then, but this was the curtain call. It was the last time Bryan Christopher would ever step foot in a WWE ring. It was the last time he would feel the specific electric love of a global audience. When the lights went out and the team flew home, the silence that awaited Bryan in Tennessee was deafening. The high of the performance crashed into the low of reality with devastating force. He wasn't back in the WWE, it was a one-off, a cameo. He was a museum exhibit dusted off for a night and then put back in storage. The emotional withdrawal from that night likely fueled the chemical relapse that followed. The disparity between who he was on that Thursday night in Florida, a legend, and who he was on Friday morning in Memphis, an unemployed addict, was too vast to bridge without anesthesia. By 2015, the narrative of partying was completely obsolete. Bryan was no longer having fun. He was fighting a biological war. To understand the tragedy that was approaching, we must look at the medical context that was largely ignored by the wrestling world at the time. Bryan's behavior, the impulsivity, the aggression with police, the inability to learn from consequences is textbook symptomatology of severe frontal lobe dysfunction. Years of taking bumps had taken a toll. While he was never officially diagnosed with CTE during his life, as the disease can only be confirmed by autopsy, friends and family began to notice personality shifts that are now alarmingly familiar in contact sports. He had mood swings that were terrifying in their speed. He could be the sweet, funny Bryan one minute and a paranoid, angry stranger the next. This was compounded by the interaction of his medication. He was reportedly taking a cocktail of antidepressants, anti-anxiety medication, and painkillers. When you mix benzodiazepines with alcohol in a brain that has suffered repeated trauma, you are creating a chemical state where choice is an illusion. The brain's executive function, the part that says don't drive the car or don't fight the cop, shuts down. Bryan wasn't just a troubled screw-up, as some internet fans cruelly labeled him. He was a man with a broken processor trying to navigate a world that demanded he act normal. The years 2015, 2016, and 2017 are a blur of police lights. The records from this period show a man who had completely ceased to care about the law. The charges were repetitive: driving on a revoked license, DUI, evading arrest. The driving on revoked charge is particularly telling. It signifies a refusal to accept limits. The state had told him, "You are not safe to operate a vehicle." Bryan's response was essentially, "I do what I want." It was the same defiance he showed when he refused to use the name Lawler, twisted into a dangerous pathology. In one incident, he was spotted driving his vehicle erratically. When police attempted to stop him, he didn't pull over immediately. He kept going. When he finally stopped, he was confused. He didn't seem to understand why he was being pulled over. This wasn't the arrogance of the Grand Master Sexay character. It was the confusion of a man operating in a fog. During this time, his circle of friends shrank. The rats and the enablers began to drift away because Brian was no longer fun. He was heavy, he was sad, he was broke. The only constant was the Steelers. He would still post about them on social media. He would still wear the jersey. It was his last tether to a normal identity. But even that was fraying. The role of Jerry Lawler during these final years is a tragedy of Shakespearean proportions. Jerry was not just a father, he was the employer, the icon, the standard bearer. Jerry had tried everything. He had tried the buddy approach, bringing Brian onto the road. He had tried the employer approach, booking him for matches. He had tried the savior approach, paying for rehab. By 2016 and 2017, Jerry had moved into a phase of desperate preservation. He was terrified that he was going to get the call. In his later lawsuit and interviews, the pain is palpable. Jerry described a situation where he felt held hostage by his son's addiction. If he gave Brian money, Brian bought drugs. If he didn't give Brian money, Brian might steal or get into debt with dangerous people. There is a specific heartbreaking dynamic that occurs in families of addicts, the waiting for the other shoe to drop. Every time the phone rings late at night, the heart stops. Jerry lived in this state of suspended terror for nearly a decade. He famously said in an interview, "I thought I could fix him. I'm the king. I fix everything, but I couldn't fix this." The relationship became strained. There were arguments. Brian, in his paranoia, sometimes accused his father of not caring or of controlling him. He resented Jerry's success even as he relied on it. He loved his father, but he hated the shadow he cast. And as Brian's light dimmed, the shadow seemed to grow longer. It was during this dark period that the darkness turned inward. According to Brian's close friend, a man named Teague, who lived in Pittsburgh, Brian had attempted suicide at least twice before the final event in 2018. Teague later revealed in podcasts that Brian would call him in the middle of the night, weeping, saying he couldn't do it anymore. He felt like a failure. He felt like a burden. The shame of being a 40-something-year-old man who had pissed away millions of dollars and was still relying on his dad was crushing him. Teague described talking him off the ledge multiple times. These weren't cries for attention. They were cries of exhaustion. Brian was tired of the addiction, tired of the expectations, tired of being the king's son. But, and this is critical for the controversy that follows, Teague and others insist that by early 2018, Brian's mindset had shifted. He was scared of dying. He had seen the edge and he had recoiled. He talked about wanting to get clean for real this time. He talked about making amends. The narrative from his inner circle is that while he was depressed, he was not suicidal in the active sense during the summer of 2018. He was a man in pain, but he was a man who wanted to live. This belief is what fuels the fire of the conspiracy theories regarding his death. As 2018 dawned, Brian Christopher was living on borrowed time. He was residing in a property owned by his father, effectively isolated. His physical appearance had deteriorated significantly. The athletic build was gone, replaced by a softness. His face was puffy. He looked older than his 46 years. He was still taking bookings occasionally, but they were sad affairs. He would show up to small independent shows, often looking out of it. He would do the dance, but it was mechanical. He was a ghost haunting his own life. In March 2018, he was involved in a fight at a hotel in Evansville, Indiana. Reports surfaced that he was beaten up badly. Photos circulated showing his face swollen and bruised. It was a humiliation. The Grand Master Sexay, who used to fight in front of millions, was now getting rolled in cheap motels. It was a sign that he had lost the ability to protect himself. He was vulnerable. The predators, be they drug dealers, criminals, or his own demons, were closing in. Then came July. July 2018 was hot in Tennessee. The air was thick and oppressive. Brian was restless. He was off the wagon again. On the night of July 7th, 2018, Brian got into his vehicle. He shouldn't have been driving. He shouldn't have been on the road. But the impulse took over. He was spotted by deputies in Hardeman County. They lit him up. Brian didn't stop. He pushed the gas. For a few frantic minutes, he was running from the police, running from his dad, running from himself. When the car finally stopped and the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, Brian Christopher Lawler had exactly 21 days left to live. He was taken to the Hardeman County Jail. He was booked. The charge was DUI and evading arrest. It was a routine arrest in a rural county. Nobody, not the deputies, not Jerry, not Brian, knew that this time he wasn't coming home. The stage was set for the final brutal act of the tragedy. The doors of the jail clanged shut and the countdown began. The morning of July 8th, 2018 broke hot and humid in Tennessee. Brian Christopher Lawler was sitting in a holding cell in Hardeman County, sobering up from the chaos of the previous night's chase. The adrenaline of the evasion had faded, replaced by the grim, nauseating reality of withdrawal and incarceration. Outside the jail walls, a phone call was taking place that would haunt Jerry the King Lawler for the rest of his life. The bail for Brian's release was set. It was a manageable amount for a man of Jerry's means. In the past, the routine was automatic. Brian gets in trouble, Jerry or a family representative posts bail, Brian comes home, promises are made, and the cycle resets. But this time, Jerry hesitated. For years, Jerry had watched his firstborn son, the boy he had once held in the ring at the Mid-South Coliseum, deteriorate into a shadow. He had tried money. He had tried rehab. He had tried screaming. He had tried silence. Nothing had worked. The tough love philosophy, often preached by addiction specialists, whispered that perhaps the only way to save Brian was to let him feel the full weight of the consequences. Jerry Lawler later recounted a conversation he had with the sheriff of Hardeman County, John Doolin. According to Jerry's account, in subsequent legal filings and interviews, he sought assurance. He asked the sheriff if Brian would be safe inside. He explained Brian's history, the addiction, the depression, the celebrity status that might make him a target. Jerry claims the sheriff gave him a promise. We will look after him. We will get him help. He is safer in here than he is out there on the road. Believing that the jail could act as a forced detox facility, a concrete cocoon where Brian couldn't get drugs and couldn't hurt himself, Jerry made the agonizing decision to leave his son in custody. He decided not to post bail immediately. He wanted Brian to dry out. It was a decision born of love and desperation. Jerry thought he was buying his son a chance at life. He didn't know he was signing a warrant for a nightmare. As Jerry hung up the phone, he likely felt a heavy resolve. He thought he had weeks to figure out the next step. He didn't know the clock was already ticking down to zero. Hardeman County Jail is not a rehabilitation center. It is a rural detention facility designed to hold people, not heal them. When Brian was processed into the general population, the reality of his situation crashed down on him. He wasn't Grand Master Sexay here. He wasn't the funny guy in the yellow sunglasses. He was inmate Lawler. And in the strict predatory hierarchy of a jail, being a celebrity, especially a wrestling celebrity known for playing a cool character, paints a target on your back. The first week was a physical and psychological torture. Brian began to withdraw from the substances that had been fueling him. Opioid and alcohol withdrawal is a violent biological event. The body screams, the skin crawls, the mind fractures, anxiety spikes to panic attack levels. But Brian had a lifeline. Somehow he had access to a phone. He began sending text messages to his closest confidants, specifically his best friend in Pittsburgh, a man named Teague. These text messages are the cornerstone of the controversy that would later explode. They were not the messages of a man planning suicide. They were the messages of a man in mortal terror. Teague later revealed the contents of these exchanges. Brian texted that the deputies were mistreating him. He claimed they were mocking him, but more chillingly, he expressed a distinct paranoia. "They are going to kill me. You don't understand," he texted. "I'm not safe here. You have to get me out." At the time, Teague and others might have dismissed this as the paranoia of withdrawal. It is common for addicts detoxing to feel persecuted, but in hindsight, these texts read like a distress signal from a sinking ship. Brian wasn't talking about hurting himself. He was talking about being hurt. He believed with absolute certainty that there was a conspiracy inside those walls to silence him. Whether this threat was real or a hallucination born of chemical imbalance, the fear was real. Brian spent his nights sleepless, watching the door, waiting for the shadows to move. By the third week of July, the tension in the jail had reached a boiling point. On or around July 28th, an incident occurred that changed the trajectory of Brian's incarceration from detention to medical crisis. Brian was in the pod, a common area where inmates mingle. A dispute broke out. The details are murky, as jail fights are rarely documented with precision unless they turn lethal. But witnesses stated that Brian was cornered by another inmate. Words were exchanged. Then violence. The inmate struck Brian. It wasn't a scuffle. It was a brutal assault. Brian took a heavy blow to the face. The impact was severe. His eye immediately swelled shut. Later analysis would suggest he likely suffered a fracture to the orbital bone, a painful injury that requires immediate medical attention. Brian, dazed and in agony, asked for help. He asked to go to the hospital. He knew something was broken. According to the lawsuit later filed by the Lawler family, the jail's response was shockingly negligent. Instead of transporting him to an emergency room for x-rays and proper treatment, Brian was allegedly given an ice pack and some ibuprofen. Think about the physical reality of that. A fractured orbital bone causes intense pressure, blurred vision, and excruciating pain. Ibuprofen is not enough. The lack of medical care likely sent Brian into a spiral of despair. He was hurt, he was trapped, and the people in charge, the ones who had promised his father he would be safe, were refusing to treat him. This incident reinforced Brian's paranoia. "They don't care if I die," he must have thought. "They are letting me rot." The administrative response to the fight was not to protect the victim, but to punish the participant. This is standard operating procedure in many correctional facilities. If you are involved in a fight, regardless of who started it, you are removed from the general population. Brian was taken out of the pod and placed in solitary confinement. Solitary is a sterile word for a horrific experience. It is a small cell isolated from human contact. For a person with a history of major depressive disorder who is currently withdrawing from drugs and who has just suffered a traumatic head injury, solitary confinement is akin to psychological waterboarding. It strips away the last vestiges of distraction. There is no TV, no conversation, just the walls and the pain in your face. Furthermore, standard protocol for an inmate with Brian's medical history, depression, addiction, recent trauma, dictates that if they are placed in isolation, they must be put on suicide watch. This usually entails removing items that could be used for self-harm and crucially conducting regular visual checks every 15 minutes. The Lawler family alleges that this protocol was ignored. Brian was placed in the cell with the very items that would end his life. He was left alone with his demons, and the demons were louder than ever. The timeline of July 28, 2018, narrows down to the evening hours. Brian is in the cell. He is in pain. He is alone. What happened in those final hours is the subject of intense debate and the heart of the cover-up theory. The sheriff's department claims that Brian used a shoelace to hang himself from a bolt in the ceiling. However, when the Lawler family later demanded the surveillance footage from the hallway cameras that should have shown the door to Brian's cell, they were met with a baffling explanation. They were told that the cameras were not recording. They had malfunctioned, or the hard drive was full, or they simply weren't turned on. To the family, and to skeptical observers, this was too convenient. A celebrity inmate dies in custody after complaining of fearing for his life, and the electronic eyes of the jail just happened to blink at the exact moment of his death. The absence of footage created a vacuum of truth. Without video, there was only the word of the deputies versus the silent body of Brian Lawler. And the body, according to the family, had a story to tell that contradicted the official narrative. Around 6:30 p.m. on Saturday, July 28th, a guard doing rounds found Brian. The scene was chaotic. The alarm was raised. Deputies rushed in. They cut him down. CPR was initiated. But time is the enemy of the brain. When the heart stops, the clock starts. Every minute without oxygen kills millions of neurons. By the time emergency services arrived, Brian had been without oxygen for a significant amount of time. He was loaded into an ambulance and rushed to the regional medical center in Memphis. The flight or drive was a blur of sirens. Back at the jail, the sheriff made the call to Jerry Lawler. One can only imagine the sheer freezing horror of that moment. Jerry was likely at home, or perhaps at a wrestling event. The phone rings. It's the sheriff, the man who promised him Brian would be safe. Jerry, there's been an incident. You need to get to the hospital. The drive to the hospital must have felt like an eternity. Jerry, still the king of Memphis, still the man who fixed everything, was racing toward a situation he couldn't fix. He was racing toward the consequence of the fatal decision. When Jerry arrived at the hospital, the scene was grim. Brian was in the ICU. He was on life support. Machines were breathing for him. But when Jerry saw his son, the first thing he noticed wasn't the tubes or the monitors. It was the condition of his body. Jerry took photos. These photos, which have never been publicly released out of respect but were described in detail in the lawsuit, were disturbing. Brian's neck showed marks. But according to Jerry and the forensic experts he later consulted, the marks didn't look like a standard hanging. In a typical hanging, the ligature mark rises to a point behind the ear, creating a V shape. Jerry claimed the marks on Brian's neck went straight across and principally on the sides, more consistent with someone being choked from behind. Even more disturbing were the marks on Brian's hands. His wrists and knuckles were bruised. To Jerry, these looked like defensive wounds. They looked like the hands of a man who had been fighting for his life, trying to pull a rope or hands off his neck. Why would a man committing suicide fight against the rope? It is possible biologically, as a reflex. But combined with the texts about fearing murder, the missing camera footage, and the prior assault, Jerry's mind went to the darkest possible place. My son didn't do this. They did this to him. The doctors were honest. The prognosis was non-existent. The brain damage was catastrophic. There was no coming back. Brian Christopher Lawler, the dancer, the champion, the son, was gone. The body in the bed was just a vessel. The family gathered. Friends came. The wrestling world, catching wind of the news via social media, held its collective breath. Prayers were tweeted, stories were shared. But in that sterile hospital room, the air was heavy with the finality of death. On July 29, 2018, the decision was made. It is the hardest duty of a parent, to say enough, to let go. The machines were turned off. The rhythmic hissing of the ventilator stopped. The room fell silent. Brian Christopher Lawler was pronounced dead at the age of 46. The official cause of death was listed as suicide by hanging. The Hardeman County Sheriff's Department issued a statement expressing condolences but affirming their findings. Case closed. But for Jerry Lawler, the case was not closed. It was just opening. As he walked out of that hospital, leaving his son's body behind, the grief began to harden into anger. He thought about the promise Julian made. He thought about the bail he didn't post. He thought about the blacked out cameras. He vowed right then and there that he would not accept the official story. He would spend his fortune, his time, and his remaining energy to find out what really happened in that concrete box. The king had lost his prince, and the kingdom of Memphis, which had cheered them both for 40 years, fell into a mourning that was complicated by a deep, unsettling suspicion that justice had not just been blind, but that it had been complicit. The funeral was held. The wrestling world mourned. But the whispers started immediately. Was it really suicide? What about the fight? What about the cameras? Brian Christopher was buried, but his story refused to stay in the ground. The tragedy of his life had ended, but the tragedy of his death was about to become a legal and public battlefield. The fight for justice ended not with a verdict, but with silence. For 6 years, Jerry Lawler waged a relentless legal war against Hardeman County, desperate to explain the missing surveillance footage and the defensive wounds found on his son's body. But in 2022, a federal judge dismissed the lawsuit, citing qualified immunity. There would be no trial, no public answers, and no legal accountability for the 15 minutes that cost Brian his life. Jerry is left to carry the crushing burden of his fatal decision to leave Brian in jail, a choice made to save him that ultimately led to his doom. To the courts, the case is closed, but for the family, the wound remains open. Brian Christopher spent a lifetime chasing the spotlight only to die in the dark, terrified and alone. The king's son is gone, leaving behind a silence that no amount of applause can ever fill.